The dust motes danced in the lone beam of my reading lamp, a slow, indifferent ballet against the backdrop of my quiet living room. Outside, the city hummed its distant, indifferent song, a constant thrum I'd learned to filter out, much like the echoes of old failures. My hands, once quick and certain, now traced the worn spine of a forgotten tome, the scent of aged paper a poor substitute for the adrenaline that used to fuel my days. I was Cole, and the world had long since decided I was a ghost, a specter haunting the periphery of a life I'd once owned. A sharp, digital chirp sliced through the stillness, jarring me from my reverie. My burner phone, a relic I kept for reasons even I struggled to articulate, vibrated on the scarred wooden table. Its screen glowed, a number I didn't recognize, yet a tremor of unease snaked through me. I let it ring, counting the pulses, a habit from a life where every call could mean a world shifted on its axis. On the fifth ring, I picked it up. "Cole," I stated, my voice a gravelly whisper against the sudden intrusion. "It's the chief investigator," the voice on the other end cut in, clipped and efficient, devoid of pleasantries. "No surprise there. We've got a situation, out near the crossing. You need to see this." My brow furrowed. "My days of seeing situations are over, chief investigator. You know that." The words tasted like ash. "This one. It's got a signature, Cole, a cold, familiar one." The air in my small room seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest. The phrase was a hook, sharp and barbed, digging into old wounds. I hated the chief investigator for that choice of words, for knowing exactly which nerve to strike. "Send me the coordinates," I said, the resignation in my voice a heavy cloak. "But don't expect miracles." The drive was a blur of highway lights and the rhythmic hum of my aging sedan. The city gave way to sparse suburbs, then to the unforgiving, moon-drenched expanse of the desert. The sky above was a vast, ink-high canvas studded with indifferent stars, mirroring the emptiness I often felt. The coordinates led me down a winding dirt road, kicking up plumes of fine sand that coated my windshield. I parked a good distance away, stepping out into the crisp, dry air, the scent of dust and something metallic, acrid, stinging my nostrils. "Cole," the chief investigator greeted me, his face grim, illuminated by the pulsating emergency lights. He was a younger man than I remembered, his jawline tighter, his eyes holding a weariness that spoke of sleepless nights. "Didn't think you'd come." "You used the right bait," I replied, my gaze already sweeping past him, assessing the scene. This wasn't a simple robbery. This was a stage. A section of heavy-gauge chain link, tall and formidable, had been meticulously excised. Not ripped, not torn, but cut. The edges of the severed wire were clean, almost surgical, glinting dully under the investigator's powerful beam. No jagged edges from a hurried hack, no bent posts from a brute force assault. This was precision. "They took the transport," the chief investigator explained, his voice low. "Armored vehicle, high-value cargo, vanished without a trace." "And the guards?" I asked, my voice flat. My eyes were still fixed on the fence, then sweeping across the sand, searching for what wasn't there. "Unconscious. Sedated, we think. No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, just lights out." My gut clenched. I walked towards the fence, the crunch of sand beneath my boots the only sound in the immediate vicinity. The clean break, the lack of distortion in the surrounding mesh, it spoke of a specific tool, wielded with specific intent. It spoke of patience. "No shell casings," I murmured, more to myself than to the chief investigator. "No footprints beyond the official ones. No tire tracks from the getaway." "We're still processing," the chief investigator began, a defensive note in his tone. "The ground is tricky here, sand shifts." "Not this tricky," I countered, standing slowly, my eyes narrowing. "This isn't a smash and grab, chief investigator. This is a ghost operation." I walked further into the scene, past the chief investigator, towards where a small team of technicians meticulously swept the ground with handheld devices, their faces intent. I spotted a faint impression in a patch of harder-packed earth near the edge of the police cordon. It wasn't a boot print nor a tire tread. It was a subtle depression, circular, perhaps the base of a small, heavy object. But it was too perfect, too solitary. "What's that?" I pointed with my chin. A young technician glanced up, then back down. "Nothing registered, Cole, just a random depression, could be anything." But it wasn't just anything. I knelt again, closer this time. The edges were too defined for a random rock fall, and then I saw it, almost invisible in the gloom, a faint, almost microscopic shimmer in the center of the depression. I pulled a small, gloved-hand lens from my jacket pocket, a habit I'd never quite broken. Through the magnification, I saw it, a tiny, almost imperceptible fleck of polished obsidian. Just a single grain, no bigger than a pinhead, almost lost in the sand. My breath hitched. Obsidian. It was a signature, a cruel, elegant, utterly unmistakable signature. The previous killer, the one who had danced through my grasp like smoke, had left similar calling cards. Not always obsidian, but always something small, rare, and utterly out of place, a single, deliberate anomaly in a scene of meticulous absence. A taunt. Wait, that doesn't add up, I thought, the words a raw whisper in the confines of my mind. Why leave anything if they were this precise? It was a deliberate choice, a message, and it was aimed at me. "Chief Investigator," I called, my voice sharper now, cutting through the low murmur of the scene. "Did anyone find anything else? Anything small, anything unusual?" He walked over, his expression wary. "No, Cole. Just the fence, the guards, and a missing armored transport. This is him. He's back." The chief investigator stared at me, his eyes clouded with a mix of pity and skepticism. "Cole, it's been years. We never even confirmed he was a single person. You were invested." "Invested?" I scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "I was broken, and I still am, but I'm not crazy." The obsidian fleck, cradled in my palm, felt impossibly heavy. He hadn't just returned. He was playing a game, restarting the clock, and I was the only player who knew the rules of his twisted chess match. The hunt, it seemed, had found me again. The desert wind, a phantom sculptor, had already begun its work, erasing my boot prints from the dust around the desert crossing point, fence-cut darkness. The obsidian fleck, no larger than a fingernail, still pulsed with a strange, cold energy in my palm, a tiny shard of the abyss itself. He hadn't just returned. He had announced it deliberately. A silent, brutal declaration echoing through the emptiness. My breath hitched, a familiar tightness seizing my chest. The ghost of a past failure, a specter I had buried under years of self-imposed exile, stirred, its icy fingers reaching for me. I wanted to crush the fleck, grind it into powder, make it disappear as I had tried to make him disappear from my memory. But it was impossible. He was back, and I, Cole, was the only one who truly understood the language of his cruelty. My old life, the one I'd painstakingly dismantled piece by piece, now demanded reconstruction. I slid the obsidian into a small, worn leather pouch I always carried, a relic from my days on the force, a silent promise to the ghosts of the unavenged. The official channels would be a labyrinth of dismissals and condescension. My name, once synonymous with sharp insight, now carried the heavy scent of disgrace. They wouldn't listen, not to me. Not yet. This had to be my own twisted pilgrimage. I drove, the old truck rattling a protest against the miles, leaving the desolate crossing point behind. My destination, the site of the most recent heist, the one that had dominated the morning news feeds. The reports spoke of an audacious raid on an abandoned factory on the city's industrial fringe, a place rumored to house a forgotten cache of high-tech components. The local precinct had dismissed it as a run-of-the-mill industrial espionage job, a clean sweep by a professional crew. They were wrong. I knew it in the marrow of my bones. The sky, a bruise of bruised purple and charcoal, still held the last vestiges of night as I approached the factory. It stood silhouetted against the nascent dawn, a skeletal monument to forgotten industry. Chain-link fences, topped with razor wire, ringed the perimeter, but I spotted the telltale shimmer of fresh snips in the wire, a neat, almost surgical incision, too precise for a hurried break-in. This was a signature. The air hung heavy with the metallic tang of dust and decay, a familiar perfume of forgotten places. A lone patrol officer, a young face etched with boredom, drove slowly along the perimeter road, his gaze sweeping over the factory's exterior. He wouldn't see me. I was good at being unseen when I needed to be. Inside, the factory was a cavern of echoes. Broken windows gaped like empty eyes, and the concrete floor was a mosaic of oil stains and discarded machinery. The official investigation, I surmised, had moved quickly, sealing off the most obvious points of entry and exit, perhaps taking a few perfunctory samples. But they wouldn't have looked for his marks. They didn't know his language. I moved with a practiced fluidity, my gaze sweeping over every surface, every displaced object. The reported target was a locked vault said to contain prototypes. The vault door, a formidable steel slab, now hung ajar, its locking mechanism precisely disabled. No forced entry, no crude pry marks, just a clean surgical bypass. The interior of the vault, according to the news, had been emptied. But as I peered inside, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, I saw something that jarred. A small wooden crate, clearly marked fragile, sat undisturbed in a corner. Its contents, by all accounts, should have been valuable, yet it remained. This didn't align with the high-tech components narrative. A professional crew wouldn't leave behind easily portable, high-value items. This was a deliberate choice, a message. My eyes narrowed, scanning the immediate vicinity of the vault. The concrete floor, scarred by decades of industrial use, offered little purchase for subtle marks. But then, my beam caught it. Near the base of a massive, rusted support pillar almost at ankle height was a faint etching. Not a scratch from a dropped tool, but a deliberate shallow groove, barely visible to the untrained eye. I knelt, my fingers tracing the line. It was a stylized, angular symbol, reminiscent of an ancient rune, but subtly twisted, almost serpentine. My breath hitched again, sharper this time. This wasn't just similar. It was identical to a mark I'd found at the scene of the last unsolved case years ago at the old Docklands. A mark the lead detective had dismissed as graffiti, a random scratch, but I remembered. I remembered the meticulous way he had placed his symbols, almost daring me to find them. This one, however, possessed a new elegance, a terrifying refinement. It was the same hand, but stronger, more confident, like an artist who had perfected his deadly craft. The original mark had been crude, a fledgling attempt. This was a masterstroke. He wasn't just restarting the clock. He was mocking me, leaving breadcrumbs only I could follow, knowing the official channels would remain blind. The fear was a bitter taste, but beneath it, a defiant ember began to glow. This wasn't just about a past failure anymore. This was a direct challenge. He was here in my city playing his game, and I was the only one who knew the rules. My personal stake, once a burden, had become a burning, undeniable resolve. I had to stop him, not just for the victims, but for my own fractured soul. The hunt had begun. He hadn't been here, not truly. Its surface, impossibly smooth, reflected the last sliver of moon like a captured, dead star. This wasn't a random act of vandalism. My truck, a rusted behemoth, waited patiently, a silent witness to my solitary vigil. The drive back was a blur of highway lines and the hum of worn tires, the fleck a constant, unnerving weight in my pocket. My mind, usually a chaotic archive of past failures, now sharpened, focusing on the edges of a nascent pattern. The second, a shout. What would the third be? A declaration. Sleep, a fickle mistress, abandoned me. The metallic tang of cheap coffee filled my small apartment, the only light spilling from the screen of my laptop. News feeds, police scanners, obscure forums, I trawled them all. A fisherman casting a net into the digital ocean, hoping for a ripple. The city felt different now, charged with a subtle, predatory energy I alone seemed to sense. Then the ripple, a brief, almost dismissible report on a private security firm's internal channel, one I still had access to from my old life. A high-value collection secured in a downtown high-rise vault, compromised. This wasn't a smash-in grab. This was art. I arrived before the official commotion, a ghost in the pre-dawn gloom, my truck blending into the service alley. I slipped past a bewildered night watchman, a man whose face was pale parchment, his uniform still crisp despite the implied chaos. My old badge, a forgotten relic, still held a certain sway, a shadow of authority that allowed me to bypass initial barriers. The scene inside the vault room was an unsettling tableau of meticulous violation. No broken locks, no forced entry. The vault door, a behemoth of reinforced steel, stood ajar, its intricate mechanisms disengaged with surgical precision. It was too clean, too quiet. My eyes scanned every surface, every angle. The walls, lined with sound-dampening panels, offered no echoes. The floor, polished granite, showed no scuffs, no hurried footprints. This was their work. The same ghost dancing through security systems, leaving no trace but absence. Then I saw it, tucked into the corner of a meticulously crafted display case. Beneath where the centerpiece, a sapphire necklace known as the Serpent's Eye, had rested, was a single folded origami crane. It was fashioned from a crisp white dollar bill, its folds impossibly sharp, its paper wings extended as if in mid-flight. My breath hitched. A crane, the same peculiar signature, the same taunt, but this one was different. It wasn't just paper. Embedded within its delicate folds, almost imperceptible, was a tiny, glinting shard. Another obsidian fleck, identical to the one in my pocket. My hand instinctively went to my pocket, confirming its presence. "Wait," I muttered to the empty room, "that doesn't add up." The previous heists, the desert crossing point, they were about disruption, about a message, but this, a high-value target, a clear acquisition. Why leave the same calling card if the motive had shifted? The fleck in the desert felt like a warning. This felt like a signature, a deliberate, mocking signature. A blare of sirens shattered the pre-dawn quiet, echoing up from the street below. The official response. My time was running out. I carefully plucked the origami crane, its paper cool against my fingertips, and tucked it into a separate, zippered compartment in my jacket, a silent companion to the first fleck. Footsteps pounded down the corridor. A familiar, gravelly voice preceded the arrival of the detective, his face a roadmap of sleepless nights and cynical observations. He stopped dead at the vault's threshold, his gaze sweeping the scene, then settling on me, a thundercloud gathering in his eyes. "Cole," he stated, his voice devoid of warmth, "what in God's name are I doing here?" His partner, a younger, sharper officer, immediately moved to block my exit, his hand hovering near his sidearm. I met his stare, refusing to flinch. I was, passing by, saw the commotion. It was a flimsy lie, and we both knew it. Passing by. The detective scoffed, a dry, rasping sound. In a high-security vault, hours before we even got the call. My old habits die hard, don't they, Cole, or are they just resurfacing? He gestured around the empty vault. This looks a lot like my old friend's work. He was right. I had let him slip. The raw wound of that failure still festered. "This isn't my doing," I said, my voice low, controlled. "But it is him, and you're looking at it all wrong." The detective stepped closer, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of stale coffee and frustration. "You're a disgrace, Cole. You lost your badge for a reason. You're not involved in this. You're not even allowed to be involved. Consider this a warning. You show up at another scene, you'll be processed as a suspect. Got it?" My jaw tightened. The accusation stung, a bitter reminder of my fall. He was right to doubt me. I had doubted myself for years. But the glint of the obsidian, the delicate folds of the crane, they screamed a truth only I could hear. "Got it," I replied, my voice flat, but inside a new fire ignited. They could warn me. They could threaten me, but they wouldn't stop me. Not this time. The stakes had risen, and I was already all in. The words of the detective still echoed in my ears, a bitter choir of doubt. "Broken. You're broken, Cole. Perhaps, but a broken compass can still point north if I know how to read its shattered face. The obsidian shard, the folded crane, they were my north. My fingers traced the rough edges of the stone, its cold weight a familiar anchor in the storm of my thoughts. I knew a truth he couldn't see, a rhythm only my damaged mind could discern. I spent the next 2 days submerged in the detritus of past failures and present anxieties. My small apartment, usually a haven of ordered chaos, became a war room. News clippings from the recent heists blanketed the worn rug. Printouts of property records, auction house manifests, and corporate registries were tacked to the walls, a spiderweb of information I hoped would catch a fly. My eyes, gritty from lack of sleep, scanned names, dates, stolen items, trying to force them into a pattern. The first heist, a rare collection of antique navigational instruments lifted from a high-security vault in a downtown tower. The owner, a reclusive financier, was known for his vast wealth and equally vast eccentricities. The second, a cache of geological samples, unique mineral formations from a private museum belonging to a mining magnate. The third, an entire server farm data wiped clean from a clandestine data storage facility. No ransom demanded, just the silent, surgical removal of information. On the surface, it was about value, about the audacity of the take, but something gnawed at me. The items themselves, navigational tools, earth samples, pure data, they felt elemental, disconnected from the usual trophies of greed. A diamond would be a diamond, a painting, but these were means to an end, or perhaps fragments of a greater whole. Wait, I murmured, my voice raspy. I shuffled the printouts, laying them out side by side. The financier, the magnate, the data storage CEO, all powerful figures, all with deep roots in industries that shape the physical and informational landscapes. But the specific items, why those? My gaze drifted to an old, yellowed newspaper clipping from my pass case, pinned almost as an afterthought to the corner of my wall. The victim's name, long since faded from public memory, was still sharp in mine. A cartographer. He had been the first. Then a landscape architect, then a surveyor, people who understood the lay of the land, who mapped the world, who understood its contours and hidden veins. A cold dread began to seep into my bones, chilling me far more than the late-night air. It wasn't just the obsidian, the crane. It was the targets. My old killer hadn't just chosen victims at random. He had chosen them for what they knew, for their connection to the very fabric of the earth, its measurement, its representation. The new heists, geological samples, data, each one in its own way dealt with understanding, charting, or altering the world around us. It wasn't about the value of the items, it was about their meaning, projecting my failures onto fresh canvases of crime. The detective's words echoed again, broken, but the pattern shimmered, insistent, too precise, too specific. It wasn't just about money, it was about a narrative, a grand, terrifying design unfolding. I remembered a small detail from the third heist, something buried deep in the preliminary reports I'd managed to acquire. A single, almost imperceptible trace of a specific type of desert flora found near the data facility, miles from its natural habitat. It had been dismissed as contamination, a stray seed blown in by the wind. But my mind, attuned to the minutiae of the past, latched onto it. The cartographer, the landscape architect, the surveyor, they had all worked on a massive, controversial land development project years ago near the southern border, a project that had been abandoned after environmental protests and legal battles. My gut clenched. The desert flora, the land project, the location of the data facility nestled on the outskirts of that same vast, arid expanse. I grabbed my worn leather jacket, the scent of stale coffee clinging to the fabric. My old sedan, a relic of better days, roared to life with a familiar cough. I drove for hours, the city lights shrinking in my rearview mirror until only the vast, indifferent canvas of the night sky remained. The highway stretched ahead, a ribbon of asphalt unspooling into the black. My determination hardened, eclipsing the gnawing fear. The headlights cut through the inky blackness, revealing only scrub brush and the occasional skeletal saguaro reaching for the stars. Finally, I pulled off onto a barely visible track, killed the engine, and stepped out. The moon, a sliver of silver, offered little illumination. My boot scuffed against something hard. I lowered the light. A discarded jerrycan, rusted and empty. Further on, a faint track of recent tire marks, distinct from my own, led away from the rough path. They were too wide, too heavy for a standard vehicle. My heart began to beat a slow, deliberate rhythm against my ribs. The ground was uneven, dotted with sharp rocks and thorny plants. My breath plumed in the cold air. Then, I saw it, a glint of silver. My light caught the metallic sheen of severed wire. The tracks led straight to a section of border fence, an old, neglected barrier now gaping wide. The wire had been cut with surgical precision, the ends twisted back, leaving a clean, silent entry point. I stepped through the breach, my boots crunching on the loose earth. The air felt heavier here, charged with the lingering presence of clandestine activity. My mandatory location. And it was no accident. The discarded jerrycan, the tire tracks, the precise cut. This was a planned ingress and egress, a staging ground. I swept the flashlight beam slowly across the ground, more disturbed earth. A faint, almost invisible impression. I knelt, pushing aside a clump of dry grass. There, pressed into the hard-baked earth, was a partial print. Not a boot, not a shoe, a tread pattern unlike any I'd seen on civilian vehicles. Heavy, industrial. My mind raced, connecting the dots. Cartographer, the land project, the flora, the data facility, and now this. A desert crossing point, a professional cut. It was all a single, unfolding tapestry of menace, woven with threads from my past. The killer I had failed to catch hadn't just returned. He had been here all along, building something, waiting. And I, Cole, had just stumbled into the first visible strand of his monstrous design. The mystery was deepening, and I was caught in its tightening coils. Broken. My fingers traced the rough edges of the stone in my pocket, its cool weight a constant, silent promise. I wasn't broken, I was just reassembled in a way the world hadn't quite sanctioned. The engine of the borrowed sedan grumbled beneath me, a low, persistent growl against the vast, indifferent silence of the night. The headlights sliced through the Inkai canvas, illuminating the skeletal fingers of saguaro cacti that clawed at a sky dusted with distant, uncaring stars. Dust devils, ghosts of the day's heat, danced briefly in the periphery before dissolving into nothingness. My destination was a whisper I'd chased through the city's forgotten crevices, a name pulled from a grimy ledger, a thread leading back to the original weaver of shadows. He was a man I remembered from the periphery of the old case, a hanger-on, a collector of small secrets and smaller payments, the kind who knew just enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be caught. I had sent a coded message, a fragment of information only he would recognize, bait on a barbed hook. He'd taken it. The rendezvous point was his choice, a place he believed safe, a place where eyes were few and the wind carried away all inconvenient sounds. My tires crunched on loose gravel as I veered off the paved road, following a track that was barely more than an animal trail. The air grew thin, sharp with the scent of dry earth and creosote. The light from the dashboard cast my face in stark relief, the lines around my eyes etched deeper by sleepless nights and unshakable conviction. Doubt was a luxury I couldn't afford, not now, not when the echoes of the past were manifesting in fresh blood. Finally, the track widened slightly, revealing a corrugated metal shack, long abandoned, half swallowed by the encroaching sand. My breath plumed in the faint starlight. I stepped out, my boots sinking slightly into the soft sand. My gaze swept the desolate landscape, searching for any sign of movement, any flicker of reflected light. And then I saw it, the specific landmark he'd mentioned, a crooked mesquite tree, its branches gnarled like arthritic fingers. I moved with a practiced quietness, each step deliberate, my senses stretched taut. The ground was uneven, treacherous in the gloom. It was the contact, a man I knew only as the informant. He was older now, thinner, his face a roadmap of hard living. His eyes, though, still held that familiar, darting intelligence like a trapped bird. "You came," I answered, keeping my voice level, though my heart hammered a rhythm against my ribs. "Smart, there's nowhere to hide from this." He scoffed, a dry, humorless sound. "From I or from what you're chasing?" His gaze flickered towards the border. "You picked a hell of a place for a chat, Cole. Symbolic, perhaps." "You chose it," I corrected, stepping closer, closing the distance between us. The air thrummed with unspoken tension. "I need answers. About the old man, the one who left his mark. He's back. That's a ghost story. He's gone, buried deep." "Is he?" I pressed, my voice dropping to a dangerous low. Then explained the obsidian shards, the cranes, the precision, the fear. I watched his face closely, searching for the telltale flicker, the break in the facade. He shifted his weight, digging the toe of his worn boot into the sand. People copy. You think you're the only one who remembers the details, Cole, the sick admiration some had for his methods. This is beyond admiration. This is a blueprint, I argued, taking another step. And I was close enough to see the original architect's hand. Tell me what I'm missing. He hesitated, a long, drawn-out moment where only the wind seemed to breathe. A signature, something small, not the crane, not the stone, something he did with the delivery. Always left it on the left side, always, even if it made less sense logistically, a compulsion, a tick. My breath hitched, the left side, the recent heists, the placement of the calling cards, the way the valuables were arranged. It always felt off, slightly asymmetrical, but I hadn't consciously registered it. Why didn't I tell me this before? Because it was nothing. He hissed, pulling back, his face suddenly pale. A quirk and he's dead. It's just some copycat trying to mess with my head, Cole, my weak spots. Who knows about that specific detail, informant? Who besides you and him? He shook his head violently, his eyes wide with a sudden, genuine fear. No one, I swear, it was just a thing I noticed. A coincidence, Cole, don't read into it. You're broken, man, or you're being used. His fear wasn't for me, it was for himself, for what he'd revealed. The specificity of the left side detail, combined with his immediate panic dismissal, felt less like a slip and more like a carefully placed, yet immediately regretted clue. Wait, that doesn't add up. He knew this was significant, and his panic was not just about sharing the secret, but about the implication of who knew it now. Before I could press further, a sudden, blinding flash erupted from behind the informant, followed by the concussive crack of a stun grenade. My ears rang, vision swimming with phantom light. I stumbled back, disoriented, my hands flying up to shield my eyes. Through the ringing haze, I heard a grunt, a scuffle, and then the sound of rapidly retreating footsteps on the loose sand. When my vision finally cleared, the informant was gone, vanished. The only lingering evidence was a faint scent of ozone and the disturbed sand where he had stood. I spun around, my senses screaming, but the vast, empty expanse of the desert offered no answers. He hadn't just run, he had been taken, or worse, he had staged the whole thing. A sharp, burning pain flared in my left shoulder. I reached up, my fingers coming away slick with warmth. A fragment of the grenade, a jagged piece of plastic, had embedded itself just beneath my collarbone. The sting was a brutal reminder of my failure, a physical manifestation of the setback. He had led me here, revealed just enough to tantalize, and then disappeared, leaving me wounded and no closer to the truth. Was he truly a victim or merely a puppet? The detective's words returned, a bitter chorus. Perhaps I was chasing ghosts, seeing patterns where there were only random marks. But the left side detail, it felt too precise, too intimate a knowledge of the killer's psyche to be mere coincidence. I was bleeding, alone in the desert, and the game had just become infinitely more dangerous, and I had just lost a critical piece from my board. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the unspoken, the half-truths that choked the breath from my lungs. The colleague's eyes, wide and suddenly vacant, were a mirror reflecting my own sudden horror. No, I had whispered, the single word a fragile shield against a truth too sharp to bear. His fear, a sudden, animal tremor, wasn't for me, but for the fragile edifice he'd built around a secret. The left side detail, a whisper of old wounds, had cracked it open. I watched him then, truly watched, and saw the subtle shift in his posture, the way his gaze skittered away from mine, settling on a point just beyond my shoulder. It was the tell of a man holding a volatile thing, afraid to drop it, more afraid to keep holding it. He stammered, a choked denial, but the damage was done. A chasm had opened between us, bridged only by my suspicion. I left him there, amidst the sterile glow of the shared office, the faint scent of stale coffee and desperation clinging to the air. The city outside, usually a cacophony, felt muted, as if even the traffic held its breath. My mind, a frantic loom, began to weave the threads. The left side. It was too specific, too intimate a detail from the old case, one never released to the public. Only a handful of investigators knew it and the killer, or someone taught by the killer, or someone who was the killer. But the heists, meticulously planned, devoid of the old killer's signature brutality. They were a performance, a misdirection. This wasn't a return, it was an echo carefully engineered. I drove aimlessly at first, the asphalt ribboning beneath my tires, each mile a churn of memories and fragments. The old case files, dog-eared and heavy with unanswered questions, lay on my passenger seat like a silent accusation. I pulled over by the abandoned factory district, its skeletal structures silhouetted against the bruised twilight sky. The heists targeted specific institutions. A vault holding ancestral documents, a private collection of antique maps, a digital archive of forgotten civic records. Not money, not jewels. Information. Pieces of a historical puzzle. And each location had a subtle connection to the old case, a forgotten street name, a minor figure mentioned in an archived report. It wasn't about the taking, I realized, but the revealing. The perpetrator wasn't replicating the killer's methods for the thrill of it. They were pointing a finger, a cruel, precise gesture. The victims, seemingly random, had one overlooked commonality, a faint, almost imperceptible link to the city's founding families, families whose histories were tangled with land disputes and hidden power. The old killer had seemed to strike indiscriminately, but what if that was another layer of misdirection? What if the true pattern lay not in who they were, but what they represented? A sudden, sharp memory surfaced. A detail from the very first victim's autopsy report, buried deep in the supplementary notes. A small, almost surgical incision on the left side of the ribcage, not related to the cause of death, but an older, healed scar, an anomaly I had dismissed as irrelevant. The colleague's panic, his knowledge of this hidden detail, slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just lying, he was actively concealing, but why? And how did it tie to the current heists? The perpetrator was collecting historical data, not valuables. They were assembling a narrative that challenged the official version of events. My phone buzzed, a message from an anonymous source. A single coordinate, stark against the black screen. No words, just numbers. My gut clenched. This was it. This was the trail. I found myself on the fringes of the city where the asphalt surrendered to gravel and the last streetlights flickered out. The road dissolved into a dusty track winding deeper into the desolation. The air grew thin, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant scrub brush. After what felt like an eternity, the headlights cut through the profound blackness, revealing a skeletal signpost. The moon, a sliver of bone, offered little illumination. I stepped out, my boots crunching on loose stones, the sound unnaturally loud. The fence, a rusted relic, was indeed cut, a jagged tear in the wire. It wasn't a recent cut. The edges were weathered, hinting at prolonged use. I saw it then, glinting faintly in the meager moonlight just beyond the cut wire, a small, weathered wooden box partially buried in the sand. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird. I dug it out, dust clinging to my fingers. It was old, intricately carved, a relic. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a single tarnished silver locket and a folded, yellowed piece of parchment. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the paper. It was a fragment of a journal entry dated years before the original serial killings. The handwriting was elegant, precise, almost artistic. It spoke of injustice, of a great wrong committed, of a family ruined by deceit and greed, by those who rewrote history. And then a name scrawled furiously at the bottom. Cole, my name. The locket, when I finally managed to pry it open, revealed a miniature portrait. Not of a stranger, but of a woman I recognized from the old case files, a distant relative of one of the victims, but also, disturbingly, a forgotten figure in the history of the very institutions now being targeted. The pieces didn't just click, they exploded into a horrifying mosaic. The heists weren't about money. They were about reclaiming a lost legacy, rewriting a stolen narrative. The left side detail, the hidden scar, was a mark of a specific bloodline, a genetic trait passed down through generations. The old killer hadn't been random. They had been targeting those who had wronged their family, those who held the secrets. And I, in my blind pursuit of a simpler truth, had missed the intricate web, the generational vendetta. The perpetrator wasn't a copycat. The perpetrator was a direct descendant, continuing a vendetta that had merely been paused. And the colleague, with his panicked denial, was either complicit or a pawn, forced to protect a truth that would shatter his own world. The person behind this wasn't just avenging the past. They were systematically dismantling the present, using my own failure as a weapon against me. The anonymous tip, the coordinates, the journal fragment, they were bait, an invitation to witness the unraveling. I stood there in the profound quiet of the desert, the locket heavy in my palm, the journal fragment rustling in the night breeze. The true nature of the threat was not just a killer, but a chronicler, a judge and an executioner, using history as their blade and my connection. I hadn't just failed to catch a killer. I had failed to uncover a truth that now, years later, had risen from the ashes to consume me. The determined glint in the portrait's eyes, the name scrawled on the parchment, the specific historical targets, it was all a carefully constructed accusation. This wasn't just a case anymore, it was personal, and it had been waiting for me all along. No, I had whispered, the single word a fragile shield against a truth too sharp to bear. His eyes, wide and suddenly vacant, were a mirror reflecting my own sudden horror. The air in the room, already heavy, grew thick with the unspoken, the half-truths that choked the breath from my lungs. The colleague's voice, when it came, was a frayed whisper, stitching together the fragments of what I had refused to see. "It's not just the methods, Cole," the colleague had said, leaning closer, his gaze pinning me. "It's the targets. They're not random, they're linked to your old case, to the periphery, people you interviewed, witnesses. They are refining, and they're targeting people who, in some small way, touched your investigation. People I spoke to, I protected, I questioned." The revelation struck me with the force of a physical blow. A wave of nausea washed over me. All this time I had seen a ghost, a shadow of the past. This was a direct, calculated attack, not just on the memory of the victims, but on me. Each new crime, each new disappearance was a twisted message, painstakingly crafted to tear at the seams of my fractured past. The perpetrator wasn't just mirroring the old killer. They were mirroring my failure, twisting it into something new and monstrous. A name, long buried under layers of professional detachment and personal regret, clawed its way to the surface of my mind. The former witness. A quiet woman, her eyes like chipped porcelain, who had seen something she shouldn't have years ago. I had personally overseen her relocation, ensured her anonymity, her safety. A promise I had made, carved into the bedrock of my conscience. The thought was a jolt, a surge of adrenaline that cleared the fog of disbelief. If the colleague was right, if the perpetrator was truly hunting down those tangential to my old case, then he was in grave danger. The colleague shook his head, a grim line etched between his brows. "Very few. The files are sealed. Only those directly involved and the subsequent oversight committee would have access to the full details. And you, of course." My mind raced, pulling at threads. Someone had to have breached the old files. Someone with motive, with means, with a meticulous, almost obsessive attention to detail. The perpetrator wasn't just a copycat. They were a scholar of my past, a cartographer of my mistakes. I didn't wait for another word. I grabbed my jacket, the leather cool against my skin, and bolted for the door. The colleague called out my name, but I was already gone, the sound swallowed by the roar in my ears. The city outside was a blur of lights and motion, but my vision was narrowed to a single terrifying point, the former witness. The drive to her secluded residence was a fever dream. Each traffic light felt like an eternity, each slow driver an obstacle placed deliberately in my path. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, the engine's hum a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I pictured her quiet life, the garden she tended, the small dog that followed her everywhere. a fragile piece I had helped build, now teetering on the precipice. When I finally pulled up to the gate of her property, a knot of ice formed in my stomach. The gate hung ajar, one hinge twisted, groaning softly in the night breeze. No dog barked. I moved with a hunter's caution, each step deliberate, my senses stretched taut. I pushed it open slowly, the wood groaning a protest. The air inside was still, heavy with a faint, metallic scent I knew too well. The living room was undisturbed, a half-finished crossword puzzle lying on a small table. Inside the cabinet, nestled on a clean shelf, was a small, tarnished brass compass. My breath hitched. It was mine. I had carried it for years, a small anchor against the chaos, until it had vanished after the original case, lost amidst the chaos of my life unraveling. I had forgotten it, relegated it to the category of things irrevocably gone. Now it lay here, polished to a dull gleam, deliberately placed. It wasn't just a discovery, it was a message, a taunt. The perpetrator hadn't just found the former witness, they had found me. They knew my past, my attachments, my forgotten treasures. This wasn't a game of mirroring anymore. It was a game of personal vengeance, a meticulous unraveling of my very being. The former witness was gone. I had failed again. My eyes scanned the room, searching for any other sign, any clue. On the kitchen counter, near where the compass lay, was a faint, almost invisible smudge. I leaned closer, my gaze sharpening. It was a faint print, not of a finger, but of a specific, intricate pattern like a raised emblem. Too faint to photograph clearly, but distinct enough to register in my memory. It was unlike anything I had seen at the other crime scenes. A new detail, a deliberate escalation. It was a jar leading out to the wild, untamed scrubland that stretched for miles. I pushed it open, stepping out into the cool, dry air. I followed the faint impressions in the dry earth, faint scuff marks heading away from the house towards the horizon. The trail led me, for what felt like an eternity, through the sparse, thorny brush, the only sounds the crunch of my boots and the frantic beat of my own heart. The air grew cooler, thinner, carrying the scent of dust and distant sage. I would find her. I would find them. And then I saw it. The faint outline of a break in the seemingly endless barrier. I reached the edge of the property, where the old, neglected chain-link fence marked the boundary. The wire strands hung ragged, sliced with precision, leaving a gaping maw in the rusted mesh. The ground beneath bore fresh tracks, distinct tire patterns, leading away into the deeper blackness of the unlit desert. There were also the scuff marks of someone being dragged, faint but undeniable, leading through the cut. The evidence was stark, brutal, undeniable. I stood there, a lone figure dwarfed by the immensity of the night, my breath misting in the cold air. This wasn't just about catching a killer anymore. This was about a personal vendetta, a calculated dance with my past. The stakes had been raised, not just for the victims, but for me, Cole, the failed guardian, the haunted man. And now I knew the dance had truly begun. I didn't wait for another wound to open, another echo to ripple through the city's shadowed veins. The perpetrator wasn't just a copycat. They were a scholar of my past, a cartographer of my mistakes, and now my unwilling accomplice in a grim, high-stakes ballet. My mind, a fractured kaleidoscope of old files and forgotten faces, finally snapped into a singular, sharp focus. Determination, cold and unyielding, settled in my bones. I would lure them out. I would show them the ghost they chased was not so easily dismissed. I spent hours at the dusty archive, a place where the air itself felt heavy with forgotten tragedies. Not touching the files themselves, leaving a scent, a trace of my renewed obsession with a specific, overlooked detail from the first string of crimes, a unique, almost artistic knot used to bind a victim, dismissed as incidental by the original investigating officer. Noted in a marginalia of my own, I let my presence be known, a phantom limb twitching, drawing attention to a file I mistakenly left ajar, revealing a single cryptic photograph of that knot, marked with my own faded ink. It was a lure for a meticulous mind, a breadcrumb for a scholar. Then came the waiting, a slow burn of nerves under my skin. I moved with purpose, a predator camouflaged amongst the mundane, setting up the second phase. It was the perfect stage for a clandestine exchange, a plausible reason for my target to be there, if they truly were watching my every move. Hours later, the desert wind was a rasping breath against my cheek as I drove. The light bled from the sky, painting the western horizon in streaks of bruised purple and dying orange. My ancient pickup truck, a loyal companion through countless forgotten nights, chewed up the gravel road, kicking up plumes of dust that dissolved into the twilight. My hands, calloused and steady on the wheel, remembered the grip of a service weapon, the weight of responsibility. The tattered, chain-link fence, violently severed years ago, gaped like a wound in the earth's hide. I moved with a hunter's stealth, my boots crunching softly on the loose stones. I found my chosen perch on a low, rocky outcrop, affording me a wide view of the fence line and the faint, barely discernible track that led away from it into the deep desert. My breath plumed in the frigid air. The perpetrator, if they were truly a student of my past, would recognize the bait. They would see the pattern, the connection to the original crimes, and be drawn to this isolated place, believing they were still one step ahead. I had gambled on their ego, their need to demonstrate their mastery, their careful mimicry. My eyes, aided by the thermal imager, scanned the barren landscape. Heat signatures danced erratically: a rabbit, a coyote, the subtle warmth of a distant rock. My own heart, a steady drum against my ribs, felt impossibly loud. Had I miscalculated? Had I become so consumed by the past that I was blind to the present? Then a flicker. A faint, almost imperceptible shift in the quality of the light, far off beyond the fence line where the track disappeared. I tightened my grip on the binoculars, straining against the gloom. A vehicle, not approaching the fence but parallel to it, a ghost moving along a different, more circuitous route. My breath hitched. They weren't coming through the fence cut. They were circumventing it. My trap, designed for a direct approach, was being outmaneuvered. No lights. No doors opening, just a prolonged, unsettling stillness. Then a single figure emerged from the driver's side, tall, slender, moving with an almost unnatural fluidity. They didn't approach the fence. Instead, they walked slowly, deliberately to the rear of the vehicle. My thermal imager picked up the faint outline of their form, their movements precise, economical. And then the reveal. They opened the trunk. Not to retrieve anything, but to display something. A single object, illuminated by a faint internal light source within the trunk itself, glowed with an eerie luminescence. It was a replica of the knot I had marked in the old file, fashioned not from rope, but from a thin, almost invisible strand of braided wire, twisted with an impossible, intricate symmetry. It wasn't a warning, it was a message. My trap hadn't caught a perpetrator, it had caught a reflection of my own past, distorted and amplified. They hadn't fallen for my ruse. They had responded to it with an arrogance that curdled my blood. The knot, replicated in wire, spoke of a meticulousness beyond anything I had anticipated, a skill that bordered on the artistic, and a knowledge of the old cases that went deeper than mere study. It wasn't just a copycat, it was an evolution. This was a dialogue, a twisted intellectual duel, and I had just been outmaneuvered. My determination hadn't wavered, but a fresh wave of unsettling uncertainty washed over me. This wasn't the ghost I had been chasing. This was something far more dangerous, far more intelligent, and utterly, terrifyingly aware of me. Climax: the air itself felt thin, scrubbed clean by the desert's indifferent breath, yet thick with the static charge of impending violence. My tires crunched over sun-baked earth, the headlight beams cutting pale swaths through the profound blackness that swallowed the horizon. Here, at the edge of everything, where the world bled into sand and shadow, lay the desert crossing point, fence-cut darkness. I knew it before I saw it, a whisper carried on the wind, a phantom ache in my bones. A glint of distressed metal caught my eye, a jagged tear in the boundary. The fence, a skeletal sentinel of rusted wire, gaped open like a wound. My breath hitched. This was it. The culmination of fractured memories and brutal echoes. The architect of this intricate, cruel game waited beyond that breach. The desert wind, a tireless sculptor, carved patterns in the sand, but it was the stillness, the absolute absence of sound beyond my own ragged breathing that gnawed at me. I moved, a low crouch, through the fence's jagged maw. The wire snagged my sleeve, a small tear, a trivial sting compared to the lacerations on my soul. They stood beside a crude, makeshift altar of stones, hunched over something I couldn't yet discern. The desert's canvas was vast, but this small pocket of illumination felt like a stage, spotlighting the final act. "You came," the figure said, their voice low, raspy, carrying easily across the short distance. There was no surprise, only a grim satisfaction. "I knew you would." I straightened, weapon raised, the desert floor a shifting uncertainty beneath my worn boots. It was always going to end this way, wasn't it? My own voice felt foreign, a gravelly rasp I barely recognized. "You wanted me here, you needed me to see." The figure turned slowly, bathed in the harsh glare of the work lamp. Not a face, not yet, but a posture, a shadow of movement that had haunted my periphery for years. "See what, Cole?" They scoffed, the sound devoid of warmth. "The masterpiece, the culmination of your failures." They gestured to the object on the stone altar. It was a collection of personal effects carefully arranged, a tarnished silver locket, a child's worn baseball glove, a faded photograph. These weren't random items, they were relics to make it perfect. Perfect. The figure chuckled, a dry, brittle sound. "Perfection is a myth, Cole, but completion, that is achievable." The original simply laid the groundwork. He was a brute, unrefined, but he showed me the path. They stepped forward, and the lamp's light caught a glint of metal in their hand, not a weapon, but a small, delicate carving tool. My eyes narrowed, piecing together the fragments. The precise cuts, the meticulous planning, the deliberate artistry of the heists. They weren't just about money. They were about symbolism. Why now? The figure reached up, slowly, deliberately, and pulled back the hood. It was the face of the assistant prosecutor who had worked the original case with me, a quiet, diligent woman whose counsel I had often dismissed in my younger, more arrogant days. He was the fourth. The memory hit me like a physical blow. The warehouse, the meticulously placed feather, the detail I had dismissed as a quirk of the killer, an artistic flourish. I had interviewed her, offered my condolences, seen her grief. I was too blinded by my own ambition, my own certainty, to truly see. He was right. I had missed things. I had been so convinced of my own genius, so eager for the glory, that I had overlooked the smaller, more personal details, the ones that screamed motive beyond mere brutality. And he had become his devoted apprentice, refining his cruel craft, using it to expose my deepest failures. "The heists," I choked out, the pieces clicking into a horrifying mosaic. They weren't just about money, they were about objects, specific, symbolic objects. Precisely, she confirmed, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Each one a fragment of the original's vision brought into the light by my hand, and now the final piece. She gestured to the crude altar. "The culmination, all the forgotten pieces gathered, a monument to your oversight." My mind reeled, doubt a venomous serpent coiling around my certainty. Had I truly been that blind? Had my arrogance cost not just a life, but warped another into this instrument of vengeance? The air crackled, not with static, but with the weight of years of unspoken accusation. This wasn't just a physical confrontation. It was a reckoning, a trial by fire in the heart of the desert. She lunged, not with a weapon, but with a desperate, guttural scream, a primal roar of grief and rage. Her hands, surprisingly strong, clawed at me, pushing me back towards the jagged fence, towards the very cut that had led me into this trap. The carving tool, forgotten, clattered to the dust. This was no longer about precision. It was about raw, unleashed fury. I stumbled, the weapon momentarily forgotten in my hand, as the full force of her sorrow, honed into a weapon over years, slammed into me. The physical struggle began, but the psychological battle had already been waged, and I feared deeply that I had already lost. My mind reeled, doubt a venomous serpent coiling around my certainty. This wasn't just a hunt. It was a mirror held up to my deepest failures, reflecting a grotesque distortion of justice. The chill of the desert night seeped into my bones, a colder companion than the metallic tang of fear. Before me, the desert crossing point, fence cut, darkness stretched, a jagged tear in the boundary, a wound in the fabric of law. The orchestrator stood by the mangled wire, a silhouette against the faint, bruised purple of the pre-dawn sky, hands clasped, almost serene in the face of their own undoing. "You see it now, don't you, Cole?" Their voice, calm and clear, cut through the wind's lament. "The pattern was always there. You just looked at the wrong threads." My breath hitched, a knot of old regret tightening in my chest. They weren't trying to escape. They were waiting for me for this final act of theater. "You used his methods," I rasped, the words tasting like ash. "You built a shrine out of his depravity." A shrine. A low, humorless chuckle escaped them. "No, Cole, a monument to your dereliction. To the one you let slip away, leaving behind only echoes and a broken promise of justice." I remembered the victim years ago, the one I couldn't save, the one whose family I'd failed. Their eyes, even in the gloom, held a desperate fire, a reflection of the anguish I had dismissed as mere grief. They had taken that grief, nurtured it, and twisted it into something precise and deadly. "The heists," I pressed, "they were never about the money, were they? They were about the message. Each target, each meticulously chosen vault, each brutal mimicry of the original signature. It was a whisper in the dark, a taunt only you would recognize. I wanted you to remember what you lost. What we lost." My gaze fell to the ground where the sand had been disturbed, a faint trail leading towards the cut fence. "The other one," I responded, "the one doing the actual work. Where are they? The instrument of vengeance, the young, impressionable individual they had manipulated, a pawn in a game far larger than they could comprehend. They are dealt with." The casualness of the statement sent a shiver down my spine. "When he vanished, you dusted your hands and moved on. I did what you wouldn't. I forced the world to look again, to see the rot beneath the surface, to see I." The raw pain in their words was a physical blow. They weren't wrong. I had failed. The weight of it pressed down, but this time it didn't crush me. It solidified my resolve. A faint growl of engines rumbled in the distance, a growing murmur on the wind. Help was coming. I had made the call from a hidden satellite phone, a desperate gamble that paid off. The detective and their team, guided by my cryptic directions, were closing in. "This ends now," I stated, stepping forward, my boot crunching on the loose gravel. "Your justice, as you call it, is nothing but a continuation of the same cycle. More pain, more loss." The orchestrator's eyes narrowed, searching mine for something, perhaps a flicker of understanding, a hint of absolution. Finding none, a flicker of something akin to despair crossed their features. "You still don't see, do you? You're still trapped in your own rigid lines." "I see a criminal," I added, my voice steady, "who used a tragedy to justify more crimes." The orchestrator watched them approach, not with fear but with a strange, almost resigned satisfaction. They had played their hand, and now the curtain was falling. "So be it," they murmured, a final, weary sigh escaping their lips. They offered no resistance as the first patrol vehicle skidded to a halt, dust blooming around it like a morbid flower. The detective emerged, weapon raised, their face grim. "Cole." The detective's voice was a sharp question in the still air. I nodded, gesturing towards the orchestrator. "They are the one, the architect of it all." As the uniformed officers moved in, securing the orchestrator, I stepped back, the tension slowly bleeding from my shoulders. I watched the orchestrator being led away, their figure swallowed by the approaching vehicles, the flashing red and blue lights painting the desert in stark, fleeting colors. The detective approached me, their expression unreadable. I was right, Cole, about the pattern, about the link. There was a grudging respect in their tone, a quiet acknowledgement. I simply nodded. The truth, when it finally arrived, was a bitter pill. I had found the answers, brought the orchestrator to justice, but the cost was immeasurable. The lives lost, the manipulation, the years of my own self-imposed exile. Standing there, amidst the growing light, I felt an unfamiliar sensation, not peace, not forgiveness, but a quiet acceptance. My demons weren't vanquished, they were simply understood. The desert wind, once a lament, now felt like a breath, cool and cleansing, carrying away the last vestiges of the night. The resolution wasn't a sudden burst of light, but a slow, arduous crawl towards a dawn I hadn't dared to hope for.